Chapter 7 gives us the trial of Justine. Remember that Justine has been accused of having murdered young William, and she is proven to be accused or brought to trial because of this amulet that resembles Victor's mother. There is a connection between the women then in this story, between the mother and Elizabeth and Justine, and in some ways Justine Moritz is like another version of Elizabeth. She holds the same type of affection for Victor and he for her, and she has been part of the family. She's roughly the same age, a little younger than Elizabeth. So they are very similar to one another. So we begin first just to flesh this out, this character of Justine Moritz, by looking at a description of Elizabeth Lavenza at the very end of chapter 6. It says, when he saw her again, 6 years before she had been a pretty good-humored girl whom everyone loved and caressed. She was now a woman in stature and expression of countenance, which was uncommonly lovely. An open and capacious forehead gave indications of a good understanding, joined to great frankness of disposition. Her eyes were hazel and expressive of mildness now, through recent affliction allied to sadness. Her hair was of a rich, dark auburn, her complexion fair and her figure slight and graceful. This description of Elizabeth is one which obviously shows that Victor is attracted to her and seems to love her. It's very similar to the description that he gives of Justine Moritz, that he is also attracted to her and seems to love her. The character of Justine, the name is important because the character of Justine is a young girl who is put upon for something she did not do, who is tortured to some degree by people that automatically assume that she's guilty and torment her because they want to see her hanged eventually. That character, it could be thought, is taken from another piece of literature. And it can be speculated that this is actually taken from another major character by the name of Justine, who's written about by a man by the name of Marquis de Sade. In de Sade's literature, Justine plays the same role that the Justine here does. She is a girl who is put upon by her tormentors and is tortured when she's done nothing wrong whatsoever. Whether or not Mary Shelley had access to this book, Justine, is hard to say, though Byron is known to have had a copy and probably had a copy there at Geneva, so it is likely that she might have seen it when she was there at Geneva visiting Byron. One of the key things about that book and about this character, the Marquis de Sade, is that Marquis de Sade held that the human person was just a machine. We are all of us machines, and that we experience intense emotions and physical experiences. Whether those intense emotions and physical experiences are painful or pleasurable, Marquis de Sade said, makes no difference. It's all the same thing. And that's why Marquis de Sade was very keen on the idea of inflicting pain on people as much as inflicting pleasure on them. In his book, Justine has this experience of being the machine within a machine. It's terrifying to her, and she feels as though she's put upon by forces beyond her control. The same thing happens to Justine here, that she is put upon and tormented by powers and people beyond her control. And the trial changes her, certainly, and brings about her death, but it also changes Elizabeth, too. Victor makes this change clear at the very beginning of chapter 7, where he's worried about his own actions actually causing this change to occur. He says, whether the result of my curiosity and lawless devices would cause the death of two of my fellow beings, one a smiling babe, full of innocence and joy, the other far more dreadfully murdered, with every aggravation of infamy that can make the murder memorable in horror. Justine also was a girl of merit, and possessed qualities which promised to render her life happy. Now all was to be obliterated in an ignominious grave, and I the cause. 1,000 times rather would I have confessed myself guilty of the crime ascribed to Justine. Such a declaration would have been considered as the ravings of a madman, and would not have exculpated her who suffered through me. So he even recognizes that what he has done in creating this creature has changed the world around him for the worse. He has become a bringer of death. Justine is to be put to death because of what he has done. And he calls himself the murderer. But if he were to confess this creature to anybody, he would be seen as a madman. Notice that further on, Justine protests her innocence. She says to the court, God knows how entirely I am innocent, but I do not pretend that my protestations should acquit me. I
I rest my innocence on a plain and simple explanation of the facts which have been adduced against me, and I hope the character I have always borne will incline my judges to a favorable interpretation where circumstance appears doubtful or suspicious.
She protests her innocence, and later on Elizabeth even protests the innocence of Justine, but it's to no avail. Elizabeth says this: I have lived in the same house with her at one time for 5, and at another for nearly 2 years. During all that period she appeared to me the most amiable and benevolent of human creatures. She was warmly attached to the child who is now dead, and acted towards him like a most affectionate mother. So again and again Justine protests her innocence and says, I throw myself on the mercy of my judges. I'm innocent. I haven't done anything wrong. But it's to no avail, because the people are already predisposed to see her as a murderess. And they condemn her hardly without sufficient evidence really to make the case. As Victor says here, when I perceived that the popular voice and the countenances of the judges had already condemned my unhappy victim, I rushed out of the court in agony. The ballots had been thrown. They were all black, and Justine was condemned. Now further on, Justine confesses to the murder. But as she says, she's confessing under duress. She does so because she wants to have absolution. And as they find out later, she is tormented by the priest that comes to give her absolution. I did confess, but I confessed a lie. I confessed that I might obtain absolution. But now that falsehood lies heavier at my heart than all my other sins. The God of heaven forgive me. Ever since I was condemned, my confessor has besieged me. He threatened and menaced until I almost began to think that I was the monster that he said I was. So her captors all torment her. Even the priest himself torments her. So everybody around is tormenting this poor young girl and calling her a murderess until she begins to think that maybe she is a murderess. This in some ways I think represents all those voices saying over and over again that you are a machine within a machine. There's nothing but the machine, that you are a criminal from the start, the moment you come into this world. And that whole series of voices that begin to say, give up hope, it's hopeless, don't try anymore. So she almost comes to that point of being tormented to give up hope. But at the very last she says, I'm not giving up hope in the world or in the goodness of humanity. She says, farewell, sweet lady, dearest Elizabeth, my beloved and only friend. May heaven in its bounty bless and preserve you. May this be the last misfortune that you will ever suffer. Live and be happy, and make others so. So at the very last, Justine seems to advocate to be alive and to be happy and make other people so. The opposite seems to be true for Elizabeth, because Elizabeth seems to begin to despair about the goodness of humanity throughout this whole trial. She is aware at first of the fact that she's the only one who thinks that Justine is innocent. When Victor agrees to stick up for her, she's overjoyed that Victor is going to do so, because now she's not the only one who believes in Justine's innocence. But when the verdict comes down, Elizabeth is crushed, and it says, alas, said she, how shall I ever again believe in human benevolence? Justine, whom I loved and esteemed as my sister, how could she put on those smiles of innocence only to betray? And then later on she also says, I would I were in peace with my aunt and my lovely William, escaped from a world which is hateful to me, and the visages of men which I abhor. To this, Justine tells her, don't go down that route, don't begin to despair. And Elizabeth is able to recall herself enough that she doesn't fall into despair. But notice that the effect that Victor's creation has had is not just the death of Justine. It's also this growing despair, this growing sense that it's hopeless, that human beings are no good, that human nature is no good, that the world is dark. And so he's a bringer of death, not just physically, but also a bringer of death mentally as well and spiritually as well.